Hi there fabric jugglers, it's Babs here from Fiery Phoenix, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make one of these cuffs. Now you may not understand quite what's so special about this, but you may spot that it's a little bit lumpy bumpy in different places. That's because this is a sensory cuff which has got beads embedded within it. It has a rather unusual pattern that you can see on there, which is creating a maze within the cuff. These cuffs are sometimes known as sensory cuffs or fiddle cuffs or wristbands, and they're used for children or adults indeed that have special needs or sensory issues. So I've created these for my son who is autistic. His favourite is, or was when he was younger, was the Minky version, which you can't see the maze pattern on it. Because that's hidden within the pill of the actual Minky fabric itself, but you get the sensory benefit of both the incredibly soft Minky plush and also the hard bead within the cuff, so you get a 2-for-1 bonus for this particular item if you make it in Minky. This is one that's been around for a while, so it's lost its buttons and so forth. But at least this shows you some of the alternate ways you can use this. I'm actually going to be taking you through the process of creating this exact cuff today. It's a very simple item. It's just a bit of soft cotton, but as I say, you can make it in Minky or any other sort of tactile fabric that works for your child. And also, as part of this, I am raising awareness for the Culture City Life Box campaign. This Halloween, they're running a Candy for Life campaign, where they're asking people to donate just the price of one bag of candy, which is $4, to save a life this Halloween. One of the most... Well, there are so many things that you worry about as a parent of an autistic child, but one of the things that struck particular fear into my heart when my child was significantly younger was that he would wander. He would just get fixated on something and everything else would disappear, and so he would wander. He would follow a snail, he would follow some birds, he would follow a tyre that he saw on a car, and if that was his fixation for that week, then you couldn't really protect against that, and you just had to be incredibly vigilant and aware all the time. One of the side effects of having autism, or one of the symptoms of autism, is that you don't have the social skills to deal with situations. So if you get lost, you wouldn't know who an appropriate adult would be to ask for help to come home. Which makes finding a child who has wandered with this condition incredibly difficult, and I lost many a night's sleep worrying about that. I was very fortunate it didn't happen to me because I barely let him out of my sight. However, the Candy for Life campaign is working to stop that worry, to stop that fear for parents. So, you know, it would be wonderful if you could spare the price of one bag of candy for Halloween, or just buy an extra bag for a stranger and donate it to the campaign. The hashtags that are being used for this campaign are hashtag Lifebox and hashtag Candy for Life. So you'll see those somewhere around the screen. I will have a link to my donation page for this campaign with Culture City. It'll be in the description below. Hopefully I'll also have it up on the screen as well for you to have a look at. So if you can click on that, and if you can spare $4 for a bag of candy to save a parent panicking and worrying this Halloween, then that would be wonderful and massively appreciated. But if we get back to this tutorial, you will need some fabric scraps, you will need some buttons. Because we're working with buttons, we'll need a seam ripper for the buttonholes, and of course you will need some pins with my little Halloween pin cushion. But if you can gather your materials together, let's get sewing. So to begin with, to make this cuff, we're going to need several things, including our scissors, our scrap of fabric. It needs to be large enough to actually wrap around a wrist, but it doesn't need to be enormous. We need pins, we need tape measure, we need our beads. This is what we're going to be using within the maze portion of the cuff. A couple of buttons to sew it on, to attach it to your wrist, and then some chalk to mark out, some tailor's chalk that is, to mark out the actual lines that we're going to be following when we create our maze on the wrist cuff. And then as we're going to be creating buttonholes, we will also need to use our unpicker. Yeah. So the way we do this is we measure the wrist, which in my case comes out to about 7 inches, but to give this some ease I'm going to add an extra inch on, so I'm going to want to make this a good 8 inches long. So I'm going to actually cut it at 8.5, which will allow for my seam allowance, and there's plenty of fabric within this section. Now the width that I want the cuff to be is about 2.5 inches, so that's going to go up my wrist by about 2.5 inches. So I need to double that up, which would give me 5 inches, and then I need to add on my seam allowance of 1/4 inch each side, so I need to add on another 1/2 inch, so that is 5.5 inches. If that maths sounds a little bit complicated, then I will have a description written in the accompanying tutorial, so that will go through that in a bit more detail. But basically I'm going to snip and rip this to the size that I need, which is 8.5 inches in length by 5.5 inches wide. So we'll just come down 5.5, and as my fabric has this little bit of stitching on the side, I'm actually going to come out by 6 inches and then trim 1/2 inch off on the darkest pink edge. So 6 inches, rip that away. We'll take off 1/2 inch on this side. So again, we'll snip that. Let's move that up so you can see. Snip that at the 1/2 inch and then rip that away to get rid of that little bit of stitching there. You don't want that. And then we now need to measure down the 8.5 inches. And so, okay, 8.5. Taking that in a straight line. So then we snip, and then we tear that across as well. So this is the rectangle of fabric I'm going to be using to create my cuff. Now, this is using one piece of fabric which I'm going to fold in half to create the cuff. If you were using 2 separate pieces of fabric, then you would simply cut them out to the width that you want the cuff to be, and then the rest of the process will be the same. So what we're going to do is place this right sides together, and then we are going to sew around with a 1/4 inch seam all the way around the edge, leaving a gap for turning. So we need to leave a couple of inches for turning. So the first thing I'm going to do is just pin that in place, so it doesn't wriggle around as I'm sewing. Now where I've folded it, I don't need to sew along this line, along this side rather. However, if this was 2 pieces of fabric that I was using rather than a single piece, then you would need to sew along all 4 sides so that everything is hemmed. And now we'll quickly move over to the sewing machine closer. So what I'm doing is actually going to be using a measuring foot. A piecing foot is how it's actually termed, and I'm going to take one of my bits of scrap and use that as a sewing spider before we begin. Whoops, clap, before we begin, so that I don't get any yucky thread snags catching up on my wristband or my cuff. Just sew that through on a stitch length of 2 and a regular stitch. And we're going to do a little back stitch at the beginning, just to make sure that everything is secure. And then we're going to use the 1/4 inch width of this foot, or else just use a 1/4 inch width for the remainder, and we'll just sew around the outside. So as you come to the corner, stop about a 1/4 inch away from the edge, remove any pins that you may have, and lift the presser foot, pivot the fabric round, and that will give you a nice clean corner. And what we're going to do is, when we get to this pin, we're going to do a little back stitch and stop, because this is going to be our turning gap. So now we can take that out. remove that pin, and then we'll do the same back in the other direction. So we'll start off with our sewing spider. Make sure we don't get snags. And then, having flipped the fabric over the opposite direction, we can then use the same portion of the foot to measure, so that we're keeping things accurate. And then remove the pins again as we go. About 1/4 inch from the end, drop the needle down, lift the presser foot and pivot. And now when I get to this needle pin, I will again do a little back stitch to secure it, and that will be my turning gap left in the centre. So take away the sewing spider. Here we have it ready to be turned the correct way out, and here's our turning gap. So we really do, it's a very simple process. It literally is turning out, and then what you may notice is that we've got quite rounded corners here. Now the reason that corner is rounded is because I have left all this extra fabric in the corner. So what I'm going to do is turn that back the wrong way out, and I'm going to trim away this excess. Don't cut through the stitch, cut next to the stitch so that there isn't an excess of fabric. And whilst you can't cut diagonally across the corner, you can cut up to the corner on that side. And then we'll do it again on the other end, and then cutting across the corner, but not through the stitching. Be very careful not to cut through any stitching. And then we'll turn it again, and hopefully this time you'll see the difference. Rather than those very rounded corners, you should see it's a much crisper corner. And then we can use a pencil or a wooden stick to poke those corners through. So what I'll do is go away and press this, and then come back, because what we need to do is press this seam allowance in here, because we're going to be top stitching and closing this. Not quite just yet, because we will be putting in the beads before we top stitch anything closed. Oops, as I'm throwing beads everywhere. But we will be putting these beads inside the bracelet or the cuff before we sew this portion closed. But first of all, I'm going to go and press this so we can see what we're actually working with. So first thing we need to do, now that this has been pressed and the edges have been turned under, so that when we top stitch everything will hide away nicely, is to check that the wristband still, the cuff still wraps around my wrist, which it does. It's not going to have a huge amount of play, so quite possibly we'll need to extend the length more than I have done. But I'm just going to be marking on here where my buttons and buttonholes are going to go. So I'm going to have one about here, and then the buttons will need to mark up here and here, so that they align. And now that I've done that, I can actually concentrate on drawing out some pattern for my stitches. Now I can either leave it so that the beads run straight up and down, or I can put some verticals in amongst there. So I think I will pop a couple of verticals in here. I'll just put 3 in, and then the rest will be some horizontals. And I'm going to change the colour of my chalk just to mark across the white sections. And I've got blue, but I think red will be less obvious if it doesn't immediately wipe away. So one come across here, one come across here, just so that there's some form of puzzle for the beads to run through. And what we're going to do next is sew through along these lines that we've just marked, and we're going to start and end each one of those lines with a reverse stitch. So if we start, they just have to be roughly where you were talking or where you marked, they don't have to be exactly. Reverse stitch to secure it and straight through. And a reverse stitch. And go down. So now that we've completed all of the horizontals, it looks quite a mess, but we'll just trim away those extra threads, and then we'll be able to run through and do our vertical lines. Now there's only a few of those, so it shouldn't take too long to complete. So you can go back through and trim this neatly afterwards. But the reason we use this the reverse stitch is so that we've locked everything in and it's far less likely to come undone while it's being worn. Now obviously this is a very, very simple design, and this is a very simple cuff made out of cotton. If you didn't want to use cotton, you could use a more tactile fabric, a minky, a plush, something with a bit more texture that your child would find soothing and relaxing, because that is the point of making one of these particular cuffs, is that it is a soothing item for your child. If you wanted to make it as a fashion item, simply forget about the beads and add in an extra layer of wadding, and then you can just quilt across the top any way you like, rather than having to create this little mini maze that we're doing. And if you are free-forming your maze, just bear in mind that you need to allow enough space for the beads to pass between each of these sections that you've created. So it's no good making something that is so tight that one of the beads will not pass through it. So we'll just run through and do these 3 final straights. Make sure you lift the needle out of the way each time you move on. So now that's gone way too close, so that's actually going to be an enclosure there rather than somewhere that a bead can get through. So if I raise that foot, as you can see, I got carried away with my stitching at speed, and there is no way that this bead is going to pass through this gap. It's just not going to happen. So that is effectively an enclosure, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that you'll have to find a different way for that bead to get through that section. But it will be no fun at all if every junction is an enclosure. That won't actually be a maze. That will just be annoying. Move that back up for you. So with this last one, I'll make sure I've left lots and lots of space. So we'll just trim this up and then we can create the buttonholes. So I've swapped out my foot, measured up my buttonhole, and I'm just going to run through my automatic buttonhole creation process. So that's step 1, step 2, step 3, and then back to step making sure the needle is outside of the fabric. And step 4. And because I want that to actually be nice and strong, I'll go around that process a second time. Yeah, so that's the first buttonhole completed. Just run on and do the second. Now, if you want to have a bit more information about how to use a buttonholer, I have a video on just that topic. I'll pop a link in the on the screen somewhere, and also in the description below. One of the tricks that I have is to pop a pin across the end bar of each of the buttonholes, so that my seam ripper can't actually cut into that particular piece of fabric. I can't cut away the stitches that I've just carefully sewn and created. So I insert the seam ripper and slide it along, knowing full well that I'm going to stop when I hit that pin. Turn it around, insert it, slide along, and again stopping no matter how hard I try when I hit that pin, so I know that this stitching is safe. So I'll just do that to the other side. So if you look from the reverse, you can see that that bar of the pin is in the way of that stitching, and that's what we're looking for, so that we've protected that run of stitching. Nothing worse than cutting through the end of your new buttonhole. Pop that in and then run along. Pop it in and run along the other way. I think those pins have done a wonderful job and kept my buttonhole nice and secure. So what I'm going to do next is run around the edge. No, I'm not. I'm not going to run around the edge and enclose everything. I'm going to pop in some beads. And you can put in as many or as few as you like. The whole point is that it's giving something of a sensory input for somebody to be playing around with. So I'll pop in 4 or 5, and then they can clearly see through the fabric, and then you can manipulate them around. Now, one thing that you must be very careful of when you're actually sewing this is to enclose everything with some pins. I do this just so that I know where those beads are whilst I'm sewing. I don't want them to suddenly pop out underneath my needle as I'm sewing on the machine. So I just make sure that they're enclosed in a little area by using some pins so that they can't escape. They can't travel around somewhere that I don't want them to be. So there's the 5 beads in a nice safe contained area. So what I can do now is go around the outside with a top stitch. Again, I'm going to be using my piecing foot, and in this particular instance I'm going to be using the left hand side, so that gives me a 1/4 inch, or rather 1/8 of an inch guide, so that as I top stitch around, hopefully I will keep everything to an 1/8 of an inch from the edge. I'm also not starting in the corner because it's very difficult for me to see in the corner exactly where I need to start. So I will come around that corner as I'm sewing and then line up and finish on the left. And we're going to start and end with a back stitch one more time. I'll just do that. Oops. Making sure I'm still not in buttonhole mode. And because we're top stitching, oh, excuse me. And because we're top stitching, I'm actually going to use a longer stitch up to a number 4. I'm using the longest stitch that I can. So I'll just do one back stitch and then we'll start. And as we come up to the edge, I'm going to keep an eye on this, and then when we are about 1/4 of an inch away, I will stop, put the needle down, and then pivot around. Making sure that these pins are actually out of the way of the needle base as well. Being careful as we come around on the side of the buttonholes, because it will become a little bit lumpy with the extra thread that we've used on the buttonhole itself. And again, slowing down as we come to that final corner, needle down, swivel about. And we want to try and match up with the original line of stitching. And then one reverse stitch, and that is done. So we'll just trim away any loose threads, which if we haven't been particularly careful on the rest of the construction, there may well be quite a few threads all over the place. And we can remove these extra pins, releasing those beads into the body of the wristband. As you can see, they fit through, but not that one. That's the one that it's never going to fit through. Slide that up there. So there's quite a few beads. Well, there's 5, not quite a few, but there's 5 beads in here that can be fiddled and messed about with during the day. And we're just going to sew on the buttons so that the cuff can actually do up. And the buttons will be sewn on by hand. So just bear with me and I'll go grab a needle. I've already sewn on the first button, and what we need to do is make sure that they're actually aligned with the buttonholes. So I've put the first stitch through, which is in the centre of that buttonhole, and now I will just sew through a few times. I've doubled up the thread, so that's half the number of rounds that I need to do. We just need to make sure that it is securely attached to the cuff. So you simply slide the needle through the shank. This is a button with a shank, because again that gives you more texture and more tactile senses. If you push on the button, you actually have the base of the shank pushing into your wrist. So yet again another tactile element to this particular cuff. That has gone through, so now we just need to stitch it under. Back up. And I appear to be being particularly cat-handed today. There we go, back through, under and up. Any time I sew on a button, it always looks appalling on camera, so I apologise for that. And one last time, through the shank, down through the fabric, and then we'll knock that away. And I've actually left that little piece of fabric there as something to be played with, or that thread there as again something to be played with if somebody wanted that. And so we just check that the buttons work, they fit through the cuff. As I tried to do it without putting all the other fabric through the cuff hole as well. There we go, and that fits through. And there we have our sensory cuff with the beads within. And it's not exceptionally obvious that it's a sensory cuff. You can use invisible threads, you can use threads that spell out a name, you can make that design anything you want. On the written article I'll show a selection of alternatives, but for now I'll just pop on the cuff. There we are. So just popped it on. You can leave the buttons on the inside where they can be pressed. You can have the buttons on the outside if you want that to be the look that you're going for. And then you've got the beads to fiddle with and play with as you push them round and about. And it gives you some form of interaction, gives you some stimulation, and it's something to do without losing things all around the place. You're not going to lose these bits that are sometimes a little bit tricky to get through, but you can. And then there's other areas that are really easy to move around in. And even if all you do is rub on that particular cuff to get the stimulation of the beads onto the skin, that also on its own can be quite a soothing exercise. So that's the point of the cuff. And that is how simple it is to construct. I haven't gone for anything particularly complex, particularly fancy, but as I say, there'll be instructions on the written article which show you how to do more exciting versions of this. This really is the quick and dirty version, so that you can get something made and constructed very fast to see if it works for your child or your adult that you're caring for. If it does work, then you can go back and spend a bit more time creating something slightly more elegant, and which they'll hopefully get a lot of use and benefit out of. So if you've liked this video, then please give it a great big thumbs up. Don't forget, go and have a look at the charity page that I've suggested, and there's all sorts of descriptions and links in the description for this particular tutorial. By donating just a few dollars or just the cost of a bag of candy, you can actually really help somebody this Halloween from wandering and from the fear, which, believe me, as a parent you feel so strongly, the fear that your autistic child is going to wander. It is very important, and I really strongly believe that that's well worth the price of a couple of bags of candy. So please give your donations, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.